My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and I live in a small town called Hartwell, about 2 hours east of Ottawa. I spent 31 years working as a surveyor for the provincial government, raised 2 kids in the same house where my father raised me, and never once thought my life would become the kind of story people warn their children about. But here I am, telling it anyway, because the truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. And what my son-in-law did to my younger sister, what he did with my own son's blessing, that truth needed sunlight. It needed air. And when I finally gave it both, everything came apart at the seams, exactly the way it should have. I need to go back to the beginning, to a Tuesday morning in February, 3 years before any of this came to a head. I remember it was cold the way only Eastern Ontario gets cold, not just in the air but in the bones, in the walls, in everything. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, reading the paper, when my phone buzzed. It was my sister, Lorraine. Lorraine is 4 years younger than me. She turned 63 last spring. Our whole lives, she was the steady one, the one who remembered birthdays, who showed up with soup when you were sick, who never raised her voice even when she had every right to. She taught kindergarten for 28 years in Hartwell before she retired. Half this town learned to read with her. She is the best person I know. She hadn't called me in almost 2 months. That wasn't like her. We talked every Sunday without fail. Then the calls started getting shorter. Then they stopped altogether. When I tried her, it would ring twice and go to voicemail. I'd leave messages. Nothing. I told myself she was adjusting to retirement, that maybe she'd taken a trip. I told myself a lot of things. So when her name appeared on my screen that February morning, I picked up before it finished its first ring. Gerald. Her voice was strange, flat and thin, like a sheet that's been washed too many times. Lorraine. God. It's good to hear you. Where have you been? A pause. Long enough that I pulled the phone away to check the call was still connected. I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said, and I need you not to react until I'm finished. I set down my coffee. Okay. I'm at Cedarview. Another pause. The care facility on Route 9. I knew Cedarview. Everyone in Hartwell knew Cedarview. It was a long-term care home tucked back from the highway, surrounded by old spruce trees. I'd driven past it hundreds of times. Why are you at Cedarview? Because Marcus and Diane put me here. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Marcus is my son, my 38-year-old son, the one I helped buy his first truck, the one who stood beside me at his mother's funeral 11 years ago and told me we'd always have each other. Diane is his wife. They'd been married 6 years. I never warmed to her, but I kept that to myself because Marcus seemed happy, and I thought that was what mattered. What do you mean they put you there? I finally said. After Douglas died, she stopped. Douglas was her husband. He passed away 14 months before that call. A heart attack in his sleep. Sudden and devastating. After Douglas died, the house felt too big. I told Marcus I was thinking about downsizing. He suggested I move to something more manageable. Said he'd help me find a place. I trusted him. You know how I trusted him. I did know. Lorraine had no children of her own. She and Douglas had tried for years and it hadn't happened. And eventually, they'd made peace with it. She'd poured that love into Marcus instead, into being the aunt who remembered every school play, every hockey game, every graduation. He was like a son to her, maybe more. He and Diane started handling everything, she continued. The house sale, the paperwork, the finances. They said it would be easier for me while I was grieving. Gerald, I let them. I signed things without reading them properly. I was so tired. I was so tired after losing Douglas. Her voice cracked on his name. Take your time, I said, though my hands were already shaking. By the time I realized what had happened, the house was sold. My savings account had been transferred into a joint account that only Marcus has access to, and somehow I still don't fully understand how my power of attorney had been signed over to Diane. I had a lawyer's appointment scheduled, but Diane called ahead and canceled it. Said I was unwell. Said I wasn't capable of making decisions on my own. The blood drained out of my face. They brought me here 8 months ago. They told the staff I have early onset dementia. Gerald, I don't have dementia. I've had 2 independent cognitive assessments done in my life, and I passed both of them. I'm as sharp as I've ever been. But no one here knows that because no one here talks to me long enough to find out. I'm just a name on a chart, a room number. I'm in room 14. How are you calling me right now? One of the care aides. A young woman named Priya. She's been here 3 months and she doesn't know the history of my situation. She saw me crying one night and she sat with me and she listened. Last week she let me use her personal cell phone for 10 minutes. Gerald, I don't know when I'll get another chance. I don't know when. The call cut out. I sat at that kitchen table for probably 4 minutes without moving. Then I put on my coat, drove to the hardware store, bought a small digital recorder and a prepaid phone, and drove home. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't call anyone, because I understood, somewhere deep in my gut, that if Marcus found out I knew, whatever small window existed would slam shut forever. I needed to be very careful. I needed to think. I also needed to see Lorraine for myself. The next morning I drove to Cedarview. I didn't go as her brother. I went as a volunteer. I'd done occasional volunteer visits at the Hartwell Senior Center years earlier, and I still had my vulnerable sector clearance on file. I called the facility coordinator, said I was interested in resuming volunteer work, and they told me to come by. The place was clean. That was the first thing I noticed. Not a harsh, clinical, clean, more like a careful, managed clean, the kind that's meant to reassure visitors. The staff were polite. The common room had large windows and fake plants, and a television playing a cooking program with the volume too high. They assigned me to a reading afternoon in the East Wing. Room 14 was in the East Wing. I knocked on the door frame. Lorraine was sitting in a chair by the window, a paperback open in her lap but her eyes somewhere far away. When she looked up and saw me, she didn't cry. She just closed the book very slowly, and I watched her make herself stay calm the way she's always made herself stay calm. And I thought, she has been doing this every single day for 8 months, just holding herself together, all alone. I heard you enjoy having someone read to you, I said, for the benefit of anyone passing in the hall. I do, she said. Please sit down. I sat. I opened my bag like I was retrieving a book. I put the prepaid phone on the arm of her chair, cover facing up, and she moved her hand over it without looking down. We talked for 40 minutes. She told me everything, the exact dates, the names, the documents she'd been asked to sign, the phone calls she'd overheard between Marcus and Diane, the conversation where Diane told the facility administrator that Lorraine sometimes became confused and emotional, and that any distress on her part should be flagged to family before taking action. That last part was the most elegant piece of it. It meant that if Lorraine ever tried to report what was happening, the staff would call Diane first. They'd built a wall around her and made it look like protection. The house sold for $940,000, Lorraine said quietly. Douglas and I paid it off 20 years ago. It was going to be my retirement. It was going to be. It doesn't matter now. What matters is they have it. And unless I can prove what they did, I have no legal recourse. A solicitor friend of Douglas's called me once, just to check in, and I tried to tell him, but I didn't have anything on paper, nothing with their names on it. Just my word. You'll have more than your word, I said. I went home and I spent 3 days making phone calls. I spoke to a lawyer in Ottawa named Claudette Fournier, who specializes in elder financial abuse, a field I hadn't known existed until 72 hours earlier, and which, as she told me, is one of the most underreported categories of crime in the country. She told me what I needed: bank records showing the transfer of funds, the original power of attorney document and evidence it was obtained under duress or misrepresentation, medical records demonstrating that Lorraine's dementia diagnosis was false or, at minimum, unsubstantiated, testimony from staff or witnesses at the facility. What you're describing, Claudette said, if it's accurate, is fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and potentially unlawful confinement. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal. What's the fastest way to get what we need? She was quiet for a moment. Honestly, someone on the inside. Someone they trust enough not to monitor. I thought about that for a long time. Marcus hadn't seen me in almost 8 months. We'd had a falling out the previous spring, nothing dramatic. A disagreement about Lorraine's estate that I now understood differently than I had at the time. He'd told me I was interfering. I'd told him I was family. We'd said things. He stopped calling. I assumed it was temporary. I assumed we'd sort it out eventually, the way families do. Now I understood it wasn't a falling out. It was a removal. He'd needed me out of the picture before he made his move. The question was whether he'd let me back in. I called him on a Wednesday evening. I kept my voice easy, casual. I said I'd been thinking about things, and I didn't want us to leave it the way we had. I said I was getting older, and I didn't see the point of grudges. He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear Diane in the background, and then he said he'd been thinking the same thing. "Come for dinner on Saturday," he said. "Diane makes a good pot roast." I said I'd bring wine. I spent Friday and most of Saturday preparing. The recorder Claudette recommended was smaller than a pen, designed to clip inside a jacket pocket with the microphone barely visible at the lapel. I practiced using it until I could start and stop it without looking. I also called in a favor from my old colleague Ray Bergeron, who'd retired from provincial surveying the same year I did and now ran a small private investigation firm out of his garage in Kemptville. I asked him to pull whatever public records existed on the Cedarview admission, on Lorraine's property transfer, and on a numbered company that Claudette suspected Marcus and Diane had set up to receive the proceeds. Ray called me back in 24 hours. The numbered company was real. It had been registered 11 months ago, 3 months before Lorraine was admitted to Cedarview. They had been planning this before Douglas was even in the ground. I drove to Marcus's house on Saturday evening, with a bottle of Cabernet and a recorder running in my left breast pocket. Diane answered the door. She's a small woman, compact, always dressed like she's expecting company even when she isn't. She smiled and said it was so good to see me and took my coat, and I smiled back and said the house looked wonderful, and we both performed pleasantness for each other, while underneath it I was memorizing the layout of every room I could see. Dinner was ordinary in the way that nightmares are sometimes ordinary. The food was good, the conversation covered safe subjects, and I kept waiting for the moment to arrive. It came after dessert, when Diane cleared the plates and Marcus poured us each a small scotch and leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who believes he is completely secure. "I'm glad we did this," he said. "I've missed you, Dad." "I've missed you too," I said. And even then, God help me, part of me meant it. "I've been thinking," I said, swirling the scotch. "I'm getting to the age where I need to think about things. The house, the savings. I don't want to be a burden when I can't manage on my own." I watched something move behind Marcus's eyes. Just a flicker. "We've actually been thinking about that too," Diane said, returning from the kitchen, perfectly on cue. "Marcus and I would love to help you navigate that when you're ready." "That's generous," I said. "You know, I was talking to someone at my doctor's office recently. She mentioned Cedarview, said she had a relative there. Apparently it's quite well regarded." A pause, very brief. "Yes, I've heard that," Diane said. "Have you been?" "I was thinking of taking a look, just to know my options." "I wouldn't bother," Marcus said, a little too quickly. It's for people who need a significant level of care. You're nowhere near that." "Right," I said. "Of course." I let the subject drop. I let the evening wind down naturally. I hugged my son at the door and told him we should do this more often, and he agreed. And Diane said, "Absolutely." And I drove home and sat in my dark driveway and breathed until my hands stopped shaking. Over the following 6 weeks, I did what they least expected. I became agreeable. I came to dinner twice more. I let Diane recommend a financial advisor, a friend of hers, I noted, someone in their orbit. I asked Marcus to help me understand my options for the house. I let them believe I was walking into exactly the same trap that had closed around Lorraine. All the while, I was building a file. The prepaid phone I'd given Lorraine meant we could talk every few days. Priya had quietly become an ally, not because I'd asked her to be, but because she was the kind of person who noticed when something was wrong and couldn't make herself look away. She told me that Lorraine's file listed her as a patient with moderate cognitive impairment. She told me that the physician who had signed off on the diagnosis had only seen Lorraine twice, both times for under 20 minutes, and that neither appointment had involved the kind of standardized assessment a proper diagnosis requires. She told me this carefully, professionally, in a way that made clear she was aware of the line she was walking. I asked if she'd be willing to speak to a lawyer. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, yes. Claudette arranged an independent psychiatric evaluation through a colleague at the University of Ottawa. Getting Lorraine out of the facility for the appointment was the most precarious moment of the entire operation, officially. Diane held power of attorney and could restrict Lorraine's movements. But Claudette had identified a technical gap. The power of attorney had been signed while Lorraine was in a documented state of acute grief, and there were procedural irregularities in the witnessing process. It wasn't airtight, but it was enough to challenge the document's immediate authority while the larger case was being assembled. Priya arranged for a routine dental appointment, completely legitimate, cleared with the facility physician, and I picked Lorraine up in the parking lot. We drove straight to the law offices in Ottawa. I watched my sister walk into that building with her back straight and her hands steady, and when she sat down across from the psychiatrist, she answered every question with the clarity of someone who had spent 8 months sharpening her mind against the walls of a room designed to make her disappear. The assessment was unambiguous. No evidence of dementia, no evidence of cognitive decline. A healthy, oriented, emotionally resilient woman with above-average verbal processing and intact executive function. The diagnosis that had put her in Cedarview was, the psychiatrist wrote in his report, unsupportable by any current clinical evidence. We had that. We had the numbered company registration, predating Douglas's death. We had the bank transfer records Claudette had obtained through the legal process. We had my recordings of dinner conversations in which Diane had discussed Lorraine's assets as if they were already theirs, already spoken for, already integrated into their plans for a property they were looking at in Prince Edward County. We had Priya's statement. We had, in short, everything. The moment I want to tell you about the one I go back to happened on a Thursday morning in October, 14 months after Lorraine's call from Priya's phone. Marcus and Diane had invited me to a gathering at their house. A small celebration, they called it some friends, a few business associates. Something about a real estate milestone. I understand now that they were celebrating the first phase of developing Lorraine's property. The sale to a buyer had finalized 2 days earlier. I arrived early. I had called Claudette the night before and confirmed everything was in order. The RCMP had been briefed. The fraud unit had reviewed the file and agreed there was sufficient grounds to proceed. I sat in Marcus's living room and drank a glass of water and watched the guests arrive. And I thought about Lorraine on the phone that February morning, the flat, thin voice, the careful instructions not to react. I thought about Douglas, who built that house and paid for it and would have been destroyed to know what happened to it. I thought about the 28 years Lorraine spent teaching 5-year-olds in Hartwell, pouring herself into other people's children because she had so much love and nowhere else to put it. And then 2 plainclothes officers walked through the front door. Marcus saw them from across the room. I watched him understand. It happened in stages, the confusion first, then the recognition, then something I can only describe as a kind of collapse. Not physical, but interior, like a structure giving way all at once. Diane's face went a different direction. Hers went still, perfectly, terribly still. They were informed of the charges in Marcus's dining room, surrounded by his guests, while the catered appetizers sat on the counter, and the playlist someone had made continued to play through the Bluetooth speaker. Grand fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, misrepresentation to a medical institution, the obstruction charge related to the canceled lawyer's appointment. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Lorraine was released from Cedarview that same afternoon into my care. I drove her directly to my house and made her tea and let her sit in my kitchen for as long as she needed to, which was a long time. She looked smaller than she used to. That was the first thing I noticed, not physically smaller, but there was something cautious in the way she moved, a new awareness of how quickly solid things can give way. That kind of thing takes a long time to heal, but she was out. She was home. She was safe. The legal proceedings took 11 months. Claudette was thorough, and the fraud unit was thorough, and in the end the evidence was simply too complete to argue around. Marcus received a sentence of 4 years. Diane received 3.5. The court ordered full restitution of the funds transferred, including proceeds from the property sale, though, as Claudette explained, recovering that money fully would require additional civil proceedings and was not guaranteed. The POA was declared invalid. Lorraine's legal autonomy was fully restored. On the day the sentencing was handed down, Lorraine and I had lunch at a small restaurant in Hartwell that had been there since we were teenagers. She ordered the French onion soup and a glass of white wine, and she looked out the window at the November street for a while before she said anything. "Do you know what I thought about most in that room?" she said. "I thought about Douglas, about what he would have done. He was always so much more decisive than me. He always knew exactly what needed to happen." She smiled, and it was a real smile, tired but real. And then I thought, he married me for a reason, so I stayed calm. And I waited. She looked at me. And you came. I'm not going to pretend the story ends cleanly. Lorraine got most of her money back. Eventually. She bought a smaller house in Hartwell. a 10-minute drive from mine. She volunteers at the library now, reading to children on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. And when she's there, she looks like herself again, fully herself. The woman who has always been steadier than the situation required. She's seeing a counselor, and she says it helps. As for me, I still think about Marcus. I'd be lying if I said I don't. He's my son. Whatever he did, whatever he became, he's still the boy I raised. I don't know how to make peace with both of those things at the same time. Maybe I'm not supposed to. What I know is this. Elder abuse is not an unusual crime. It is a common one. It happens in fine houses and ordinary ones, in families that look functional from the outside, in situations where the person being harmed is too exhausted or too trusting or too alone to fight back. It happens to people who spent their whole lives taking care of others and never imagined they would need to be taken care of in return. If you are watching this and something about my story feels familiar, even a small part of it, even a detail, please pay attention to that feeling. Call the person you haven't been able to reach. Visit them in person. Trust what you notice. The window to act is not always open for long. If you are in Canada and you suspect an older person in your life is being financially exploited or unlawfully controlled, you can contact your provincial adult protection services, the RCMP non-emergency line, or a lawyer who specializes in elder law. Organizations like the Canadian Centre for Elder Law exist specifically to help families navigate exactly these situations. You do not have to have all the answers before you make that first call. You just have to make it. Lorraine asked me once, near the end of all of it, why I hadn't gone to the police from the very first day, the moment she called me from Priya's phone. I told her the truth. I was afraid that if I moved too fast, they'd move faster. That they'd transfer Lorraine somewhere else, revoke every access point, make her completely unreachable. I was afraid that a single wrong step would cost us the only advantage we had, which was that they didn't know I was coming. She nodded slowly. Like surveying, she said. You have to understand the ground before you move anything. That's right. 31 years of measuring what was already there before deciding what to build. Maybe that was the only thing that made me useful when it mattered most. The truth does not always come out on its own. Sometimes it needs someone willing to be patient and precise and a little bit relentless. Be that person for the people you love. Be that person before they have to ask.